Welcome back to Tending to Talks. Today, my guest is Rosalva Aída Hernandez Castillo, a prominent Mexican anthropologist known for her research on indigenous rights, gender issues, and social movements in Mexico. A professor and senior researcher at the Centro de Investigaciones y Estudios Superiores en Antropología Social in Mexico City, she's currently working on a book titled Digging for Hope in Mexico, a feminist ethnography in the land of mass graves, and has just completed her Radcliffe Fellowship at Harvard. Aída has written extensively on topics such as indigenous women's activism, indigenous autonomy, and the intersection of gender, ethnicity, and class in Mexican society. Her work often examines the complexities of identity, power dynamics, and resistance within indigenous communities. Thank you so much for finding the time to meet with me today. I know that the last couple of months have been very hectic.
Thank you, Anna, for inviting me. It is an honor to be able to talk and share some of my experiences and knowledge with your audience.
I tend to start these conversations with asking my guests to introduce themselves and their work in their own words. And that being said, would you mind talking a little bit about your incredibly broad activism and research work, what it entails, what it looks like, and why have you decided to focus your efforts, your life efforts, essentially, on this particular topic?
Well, I'm a Mexican anthropologist and also a feminist activist, and an activist that had been working with indigenous organizations in general, and more recently with relatives of people that have disappeared in the Mexican territory. And since early age, I was probably 18 when I start combining. I was an undergraduate in the National School of Anthropology in Mexico City. I came from the north. I was born 1 hour from San Diego in the Mexican city of Ensenada in Baja California. So at 17-year-old, I moved to Mexico City to study anthropology. And since then, I was very clear that I was very interested in knowing more about the indigenous legacy of this country that has been, in a way, appropriated in the national discourse, but at the same time, silenced with very racist institutions and structures that are based in this colonial legacy. So coming from a family in which our indigenous roots had been denied, in my parents' side, my grandfather was part of the Mayo Yoreme tribe. That is one of the groups of the north of Mexico. He was from the state of Sinaloa. And because of the racism in the Mexican society, a lot of families that consider themselves mixed race, mestizos, usually do not explore or vindicate their indigenous roots. That was the case in my family. So I was very curious to find out more about why the denial of this memory. So I discovered anthropology as an accident in a way, because when I was 17-year-old, I always liked to write. I was writing poetry, and I won an state prize in poetry in Baja California, in my city. And the first prize was a trip to Mexico City. For the people that are not familiar with the geography of Mexico, from Ensenada to Mexico City, it is around 52 hours by car. So it's huge. It's like going from Madrid to, I don't know, Stockholm or something like that.
Moscow, maybe.
To Moscow. So I came for first time to Mexico City. And when I visit the Museum of Anthropology, I was very amused, of course, with cultural roots of the nation. And it's a very nationalistic project, the museum itself, the way it's presented, the Aztec culture, the richness of this culture. But the second floor is the ethnographic rooms in which they talk about contemporary Mexico. So I was very impressed by this richness. There are 63 different recognized indigenous peoples in Mexico. And those 63 groups are also divided internally linguistically. So for so long time, I used to hear about the Aztec culture, but very little about these 63, including my own roots from the Mayo Yoreme people. So I decided to study anthropology, but since the beginning of the career, I was always concerned of this huge question that had guided my academic work and my activism. Knowledge for what? Why do we want to write about the people that we work with? That in my case is usually people that have suffered exclusion and that different levels of social suffering. So we want to document social suffering, to write books that will being read by experts, that will write other books that will be read by experts. And I was ethically very, how could I say, challenging or with a lot of discomfort about the colonial legacy of anthropology. And first door that I found, I'm talking about the 80s. I'm not going to tell you my age, but I was then 17 years old in the 80s, and the civil wars in Central America were taking place. And a lot of indigenous people from Guatemala, mainly from the Maya peoples, different subdivisions of the Maya, came to Mexico as refugees. We were talking then about 46,000 Maya Guatemala refugees in Mexico. And some of them came to the National School of Anthropology. I became a very good friend of a Cachiquel student from the Maya Cachiquel people, Doroteo Ush, who had a long history that he became a mayor of his town later, years later. And also with a group of non-indigenous mestizo students who came to Mexico because the School of Anthropology was closed during the dictatorship of Efraín Ríos Montt. And when they came to Mexico, it was a press agency called Infoprensa that was created by journalists on exile. And I always say that I owe more to Infoprensa than to Stanford University, where I did my master and my PhD years later, because I learned how to write. And I also learned the possibilities of journalism when it's linked to your academic work. How can we go outside the crystal castle of academia and to try to contribute with critical analysis to the critical thinking? It was in Infoprensa that I became more familiar with the analysis, with a more global analysis of the impact of imperialism and militarism in the Americas. So I could say that my academic work has always been linked to work in the media, but also to the interest of putting the local ethnographies, the richness of local ethnographies in the context of global process. How can we understand, for example, what happened in Guatemala during the civil wars with the links, with the systemic links of the presence of a militaristic patriarchal culture that travels with weapons, with techniques, also with ideas who and how can people be tortured, and how historically these experiences in Central America with the counterinsurgency, for example, during the 80s, the CIA contributed to the creation of elite troops and also the US Army. These elite troops called caiviles were trained in the School of the Americas, first in Panama and then in Georgia in the United States. And people that has written about militarism had analyzed the militarist manuals that were used and that really legitimized the use of torture. And years later, a lot of these young men that were caiviles during the Civil War were recruited by the cartels, by the organized crime, because they have the techniques, they knew how to use the weapons, they were a specialized labor force, and were without jobs after the peace accords in Central America, Guatemala specifically, and they became one of the most bloodiest cartels in Mexico, the CIESAS. So I'm pointing this because now I'm working with the consequences of the impact of organized crime and the alliance with state forces, with the army, with migratory forces in Mexico. And I always want to emphasize that a lot of the violence that we're living right now, because we're passing one of the worst human rights crises in the contemporary history of Mexico. We have around 117,000 people that have disappeared. The majority of these people from poor racialized territories in Mexico. So the colonial structure also marks how violence is impacting in different ways to the Mexican population. When you see all these movies in Netflix or in the global about the cartels in Mexico, you see these terrible men, a lot of them racialized, by the way, dark men, dark-skinned men using weapons. And you barely hear where are those weapons coming from and where is the drug going to. And if we ask these two questions, we will see that the crisis that we're living in Mexico, it doesn't have to do with weak institutions only or with failed democracies, as some political science presented, but it has to do with global processes in which militarism, the weapon market, the drugs market had influenced a lot what we're living through. So my interest is, just to try to summarize all this. On one hand, in a methodological terms, how to produce knowledge that can be relevant for the people that we work with. And I can talk a little bit more about these collaborative methodologies later, but that this knowledge is not only produced by the scholar, but that is produced in dialogues of knowledge with the people that we work with. And this include also accompanying the process of self-representation by helping me. Now I work mainly with women, with the women that I work with, to write their own books, to make their own podcast, to do their own journalist representations, and also to co-author some of these products with them. And so this is not then the issue of going to those poor racialized territories, appropriating their knowledge and translating this knowledge to theoretical terms so I can write my books. So I want to really, when we talk about decolonizing, is not only to show how the colonial structure marks the distribution of violence, but also decolonizing our own academic practices in the way we produce knowledge and the way we present that knowledge. And the other level is how to combine the tools that anthropology gives me, that is the ethnography, to put the body where the violence is, to put the body where the resistance is, to describe these politics of daily life resistance, but to put this process into the global context of the global process that make possible this grievance, this violence, but also that can reinforce this resistance.
So in other words, to empower the individuals and the communities to regain their agencies.
Well, I feel a little bit uncomfortable with that language because it still is very epistemically arrogant that I will empower them. And who am I to empower them? I think that to phrase it in a different way, I will say to create dialogues of knowledge in which the knowledge that I have can contribute to the struggles that they have and to recognize their experience and their knowledge. So probably they are empowering me in a sense because they have more experience of resistance that I do, because they are living those violences in daily life and surviving those violences in daily life. So I would like more that empowering them or giving voice, because this is used a lot, giving voice to those that do not have voice. I still see a lot of arrogance in that. What I would say is to open spaces of dialogue and to be able to destabilize my own certainties about justice, about rights, to be able to build together an agenda that recognizes different paths to justice and different ways of being in the world.
Let's talk about these methodologies. How can indigenous communities effectively resist militarization?
Well, I have been, when I say that they are my professors, I have been inspired a lot by the struggles that already exist. And I just want to use two examples about this. And the first one is the role of the Zapatista woman in the construction of the autonomic regions in the south of Mexico. So since many people, I'm not going to go a lot into this, but many people probably of your audience know that in 1994, a group of indigenous people from the southern state of Mexico, the 1st of January 1994, the same day that the free trade agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the United States started, a group of indigenous guerrilla fighters took some of the main municipalities of the state of Chiapas, including the city where I was living, San Cristobal de las Casas. And they were denouncing the impact of globalization, of neoliberal capitalism in the dispossession of indigenous territories. But it was always, they were also linking this globalization to the colonial legacy. So colonial capitalism, that could sounds like a contradiction, but they were pointing that the specific way in which neoliberal capitalism express itself in our territories is marked by the colonial legacies that had created certain kind of territory and distribution of resources. In this movement, there were the women who expressed themselves, and they were also part of as the guerrilla fighters, but they distribute this in August 1994, a document that was like a newspaper, guerrilla newspaper called El Despertador Guerrillero, in which they included the Women's Revolutionary Law, La Ley Revolucionaria de Mujeres. It was the first guerrilla, leftist guerrilla in the continent that included in their political agenda the specific demands of indigenous women. And in this Women Revolutionary Law, they talk about the right of indigenous peoples to self-determination. And this includes to decide how and when the state can enter into their territories with the right of consultation. And this is a first tool. So it's very interesting because it's a community law, but it's a community law that is in dialogue with international law. So a lot of these women already know the framework of international rights that had been also a result of the struggles of indigenous peoples, and is the right to the previous consultation when you enter into their territories. So this tool was a tool against the entry of the army into the indigenous territories. And some of their demands were directed to the Mexican state. For example, the right to inherit land, because the Ejido system that was a result of the Mexican Revolution was then totally in hands of the head of the family, that was a man. Some others were directed to their community authorities. So they were demanding the right to be part of their community authorities. Some others were directed to their own family, the right to decide with whom to marry. And later we found out that this law was the result of a consultation in different communities of the Maya areas, El Tal, Tzotzil, Chol, in which women expressed their main concerns. So in the last 30 years, the Zapatista movement has created autonomic regions in the state of Chiapas and the south of Mexico. And in these communities, they have established their own justice system, recovering a lot of the conciliatory procedures of what is considered indigenous law. But they have reinvented indigenous law, including women's rights as part of the indigenous law. with the woman revolutionary law. And this, in this specific area, has been very important because in their struggle for autonomy, the army is not allowed to enter into their communities. And in that area, in all the Zapatistas communities, there had not been one disappearance inside the autonomic, in a country in which you have 117 people disappeared, not one case of femicide. So there is something that we can learn about these social experiments. But something else that is very important about the Zapatista experience is that being the first indigenous project in which the rights of women are considered as central as the collective rights, the women's revolutionary law became a symbol that indigenous women have rights. And this is not only in Mexico. I have found people in Ecuador using the women's revolutionary law as a part of the struggles of indigenous women in Pachacuti in Ecuador, in the movement of Pachacuti, and Bolivia also. And this, even when not, there are indigenous women that do not know every detail of the women's revolutionary law, that you can find it on the internet if you want to look for that. In our book, Dissident Woman, that I edited with the Chickasaw scholar Shannon Speed and Lynn Stefan, we translate the law as a part of the book. You can find the Dissident Woman in internet, but also the law itself became a symbol for many other women. And what this women's revolutionary law show is that this idea that collective rights and women rights are against each other is a false dilemma. That indigenous women have said that for them, in order to have really access to all their rights, their collective rights have to be recognized. So there is not this very Western conception of the individual and the collective, because their conception of personhood, it also goes beyond the individual. It considers the right of the water, the right of the mountain, the right of the tree, to be part of, to be with me, to exist. Women's revolutionary law had been used also to confront some of the most misogynist indigenous authorities in many communities, in which when women say we want to participate, we want to have right to inherit land, they say this is Western ideas, this is Western feminism, it's against our culture, because in our culture we don't talk about women's rights. So for a lot of these women, instead of saying, well, the UN says that women have rights, instead of saying this, what they say is that the women revolutionary law said that indigenous women have rights. And they have also struggling to include their women rights in their customary law in different regions of Mexico and the Americas. So this is a very interesting phenomenon. Struggling against militarism and for women's rights from their autonomic projects. But then there are other areas in which it has been more difficult to create autonomic projects. And this other area is that I want to use as an example is the highlands of Guerrero, the state of Guerrero in the center of Mexico, where I have been working also for many years in the MEPA region. And in this area, the indigenous organizations have organized against the militarization of the mountain. And it's mainly because with the excuse in this case of the war against drugs, the cultivation of natural drugs, the army had entered into a lot of indigenous community, had burned their crops, even when there are other kind of crops, and they have criminalized their indigenous organizations. So indigenous women have been very active in working together with the men of their organizations against militarism. And in one of these cases was the case of the OPIM, la Organización MEPA del Pueblo Indígena, the Organization of MEPA Indigenous Peoples, OPIM, in which 12, almost more than 12 years ago, the army entered into their communities and raped several indigenous women that were participating in this organization. And two of these women, Inés Fernández Ortega and Valentina Rosendo Cantú, decide to denounce. They didn't speak Spanish, only MEPA. So they look for the support of a human rights organization that is called La Chinola, that is in a city of the same area, in the city of Tlapa. And in this case, they use the international law to struggle against the impact of militarization. Because first they put the demand they denounce the use of sexual violence as a tool of counterinsurgency and their specific experience of rape in the Mexican justice system. But what happened is that they experienced the racism that characterized the Mexican justice system. They didn't have translators, and the proofs, the DNA proofs that they took after the rape were lost, and their case was sent to a military trial, to a military judge. So when they saw that the Mexican justice system was not working, they, together with the human rights organization, decide to take the case to the Inter-American Court. And it has been a very interesting case that I have been able to accompany for 14 years now. They contact me because I had been doing expert witness reports for indigenous women in different legal systems. And one of the issues that happened after these rapes is that one of the woman activists that was raped, Inés Fernández, said to the human rights defenders, for me, to put the 3 rapists on jail is not justice. For me, justice would be that we take the army out of our territories, that the army would not have the right to enter without previous consultation to our local authorities. And justice would be that this experience will not repeat for other indigenous women in the area. But it was also the issue that they didn't have junior high schools or high school in the MEPA communities, and they didn't have public transportation. So the girls had to walk several hours in the mountains to be able to go to the municipality city to go to junior high school and high school. Doing this, walking in the mountains, they were captured by the army and raped. So it was not the only case. So she also wanted to create, she was very clear in her needs, in the needs that she had recovered as an activist working with this organization in the area. She said, we need a boarding school run by indigenous women in which the girls can be safe, but they can also learn about their rights and how to confront racism at different levels. So when she had these very clear demands, the legal representatives that belong to these human rights centers, La Chinola, decided that to have collective demands for an individual grievance, a rape, to have a legal struggle in the court, to develop the argument why it was need to have collective reparations for an individual grievance. And that's how they contact me. Mm-hmm. So I can do an expert witness report in which I could talk about how these rapes impact the whole community, and also how the specific epistemologies about the body, about the soul, about the impact of violence should be taken into considerations when you are talking about reparations in cases of indigenous victims. So with this invitation to participate in the legal team as an expert witness, I just started to work in that area, in the MEPA area. I met Inés, and we have been working together for 15 years now. She's one of my teachers. She's an inspiration for me. And honestly, at the beginning, when I had my first interview with her, I was concerned that it was another case of a strategic litigation in which the main issue was to stop the army to go into the territories, and that in order to do that, we could be re-victimizing Inez by taking her into these international courts, having to say their story over and over again. And I didn't want to be part of this if this was the case. So I have this first private interview with her and another woman of her organization who was bilingual, because then Inez didn't speak any Spanish and I didn't speak the Mepa language. And in this interview, Inez told me very clear. She said, nobody is pressuring me to do this. Before the rape took place, I was already struggling to change things for the women in my communities. And if in order to pressure the Mexican state to take the army out of our communities, I have to go far away and say my word, I will do it for the other woman. I don't want other woman to suffer what I have suffered. By the way, she was raped in front of her 4 kids by 3 army men. And their 4 kids were minors. They were 4, 5, 10 years old. It was a very traumatic experience. So when I discovered the courage that Inez had, so I decided to go into the case. I'm not gonna go into the case, but it was an incredible experience. And to make the long story short, it has been the first case in the history of the Inter-American Court in which an individual grievance has communitarian reparations. There were other cases of massacres of indigenous peoples with communitarian reparations, but it's the first case of an individual grievance, the rape of Inez Fernandez and Valentina Rosendo Cantú. And as a part of the reparations, she demanded boarding house for girls. So the idea was to have a women's center in which they could have a medical doctor, a lawyer, a psychologist, and a social worker, all of them bilinguals in MEPA. And this center will accompany the cases of violence suffered by indigenous women, but at the same time will give training to struggle for justice to indigenous women, and will be linked and will be in the same space that the boarding school that they decided that will be not just for girls, but also for boys, because they have this moralistic idea that to work against gender violence, we have to work with girls and boys. So almost, I have to go back to the data, to the specific data, but this, I think 3 years ago, they opened this center that is called Guwa Kuma. It was 11 years after the sentence. The sentence of the Inter-American Court, we were finally able, the sentence was given in August 13, 2010, and the center, after years of struggle, the center was opened in 2021. And during all these years, I have been working with this organization, accompanying the process, and they have been building a network. And Guwa Kuma is a beautiful project. We're just finishing a documentary film with them about the project. They have around 45 boys and girls that live in this boarding house, that are receiving workshops about how to stop and not to reproduce gender violence, and also against racism. And one of the daughters of Fernandez, who was a little girl who witnessed the rape of her mom, is now a lawyer. She's totally bilingual. Her name is Noemi Prisciliano and is the lawyer of the center. And another one of the girls is a psychologist, and she's also totally bilingual, and she's working mainly with the boys in the boarding school. And they have not been able to find a medical doctor that is bilingual, but a nurse that is bilingual. So this is a beautiful project that took many, many years. No? It took 10 years to get the sentence and another 10 years to get the project built. But they continue there, they continue struggles, and we have the new generations that are working against patriarchal violence and against militarized violence in that region.
Wow, this is wonderful. You have answered all my questions for this story, and what an incredibly inspiring story as well. All of patience and dedication, but victory at the very end. We don't have much time left, and like I said, you were so detailed. I just want to ask you, looking ahead, what do you see currently as the most pressing challenges and also opportunities for indigenous movements in Mexico? And what role can researchers, activists, and policymakers play in advancing indigenous rights and autonomy?
Well, I see now as an urgent situation, and is what I have been working the last 6 years. Well, is the link between the organized crime and the criminalized states in the Americas. And I speak in plural because I think that it also includes the state in the United States, for example, no? That how the organized crime has been working in complicity with a lot of these criminal states. So there is a lot of violence in a lot of the indigenous communities that each region has its specificities. For example, the autonomic regions of the Zapatistas is a very different case than the Montaña de Guerrero, where Inés Fernandez is. But in a very simplified way, what I have been documenting, I don't have time to talk about this experience, but 7 years ago, I went back to the land of my ancestors, to the Mayo Lloreme area in Sinaloa. That is an area that is under the control of the cartels. Is terrible, the level of violence and disappearance that they are suffering there, and the lack of collective organization because of the violence and the fear. But what I see as a pattern, in a very simplified way, of course, is that many of these criminals are now distributing chemical drugs like methamphetamine since junior high school. So you have kids that are 12-year-old and start to consume methamphetamine. And through addiction, they are able to recruit these young indigenous men or racialized poor men into their organizations. And they start from the bottom. Some of them are halcones, hawks, that means just kids that help to observe when the police is coming, when they can go here or there, whose police can be by and can be their help. So they start, then they go to sell small drugs. But in many of those cases, these kids continue consuming methamphetamine. So after some years or months, even depending their physical situation, they're not useful anymore for the criminal organizations. So they kill them and they end in a clandestine mass grave, being bodies that do not care because they are stigmatized as part of the organized crime. This way of, how could I say, in a way, is another way of another form of colonial invasion to indigenous territories. And it's being terrible because it's a very sophisticated way of controlling population. And because of the violence, the level of violence that exists, the disappearance, the clandestine mass graves, the forced recruiting of those kids, there are entire communities that have been displaced. This had happened in the Mayo Lloreme area in Sinaloa, but in many other areas of Guerrero, where Inés Fernandez project is, and more recently in Chiapas, outside the autonomic communities. Now the autonomic communities are being surrendered by the organized crime. They are resisting, but many of these other communities have been displaced. And I cannot prove the direct linkage between displacement, dispossession, and mega project. But there are people that are working through maps to show you how violence moves, producing displacement, and then you have mining projects arriving, for example, in Guerrero. So it is very urgent to have, and I go to the second part of your question, to do more interdisciplinary research in which some of us can do ethnography on the ground to show the impacts of this violence and this process. And other people can do a more economic analysis of how capital move, how the mega projects are being installed, and from the critical geography to show, to map this violence, this dispossession, and these mega projects to show physically how do they overlap. Because this violence has multiple layers, the structural violence, the institutional violence, the criminal violence, the local violence. How do you see these different levels building new forms of male subjectivities also, indigenous male subjectivities? That's when we become, the challenge become bigger, because now the enemy doesn't come from the outside. The men that are using weapons that comes from this traffic of weapons from the north can be the husband that used to beat his wife in the past. But now he has an entire army behind him. And this army can be the organized crime or can be the army itself. So how centers like the center founded by Inés Fernández can confront, they help these women that are victims of violence, but they're much more vulnerable because the perpetrators are not isolated and they are now using weapons that in the past were only being used by the army and now they're all over the place. So that is why, because these new violence subjectivities, male subjectivities, are also product of this historical moment that becomes more urgent to work with the boys in the communities. And this is happening in the autonomic regions with the Zapatista boys, but it is also happening in Wuwakuma, the center that Inés has created. We are working, I say we because I feel that I'm part of this project, although it belongs to them. I'm not empowering or giving voices, their project. For 20 years, they have been working in this. And of course, if we have a pessimistic perspective, the monster is huge. The monster is not just the cartels, it's not just the criminal state, it's also the transnational militarized culture that travels with weapons. So a boarding school in the Montaña de Guerrero is not going to confront all this, but there are seeds of hope that you see that are being built. And also that they are building alliance that cross borders. Just to give you an example, last year, indigenous women that have been victims of militarized violence and had used the Inter-American system got together in San Cristobal de las Casas. It was a space promoted by an international human rights organization, CEGIL, that has its branches in Costa Rica and had accompanied some of those cases that invited these indigenous women in. I was not able to be there because I was in sabbatical in the US, but Inés told me about the experience. And it was mainly a self-critique by CEGIL of how to do litigation and how to consider their indigenous epistemologies when they are demanding reparations. And they wanted to hear the case of Inés because it was one of the few cases in which their indigenous epistemologies or cosmovisions were considered. So in this encounter, women from Peru, women from Guatemala, from Colombia, got together and they shared their strategies of resistance. And this is also happening, for example, in other experience that I have accompanied of women that have suffered the violence of the punitive state through prison. They are also creating anti-prison networks that are denouncing that the criminal justice is a racist justice, and the prison have colors. There are racialized women, indigenous and Afro descendants in the Americas. They're ones that are inhabiting the prisons, and they are building alliances that cross borders. So I would like to close this reflection by saying that we as anthropologists or critical scholars had a lot to learn from the struggle for justice of indigenous, Afro, and racialized popular women in the continent. And that we have to be open to destabilize our certainties around women rights, around justice system, to learn other ways of being in the world, other ways of understanding justice that goes beyond the physical body, that includes justice for the territory, that includes human and non-humans in their conception of justice. Because in order to survive and to have a dignified life, we have to defend life in all its manifestations. And that's what indigenous women in the Americas are teaching us, that we have to go beyond the limited conception of women's rights.
Rosalva, thank you so much for this incredible wealth of experience and research that you have done and the cases that you have shared with us today. There isn't really anything else that I can ask or that I can add. It is both overwhelming, and I hope that through this conversation, a lot of people will also feel that the change is taking place, even if it's a little bit slow, and that we are not completely devoid of hope. To all of you listening, as usual, underneath this episode, you will find links to Rosalva's publications and books, and I strongly, strongly recommend to all of you interested to familiarize yourself with her work. To you, Rosalva, thank you very much. And what can I say? I mean, I hope we will get to hear more of your wonderful work, and I hope the case of Mexico will become close to the heart of everyone on this planet.
Thank you very much. I would just like to close by saying that we have elections in Mexico 3 days ago, and for the first time in the history of Mexico, we have a woman president, and I really hope that she will govern with a heart and a mind of a woman and hear the needs of indigenous women, the families of the disappeared people, and other women that have been struggling and until now have not been heard.